Alpha King Marcus Vane had ridden into the mountain village of Hollow's Reach chasing a rumor about grain theft along the northern trade route, and found instead a woman he had buried, in his own mind, 3 years earlier, standing behind a market stall's rough wooden counter, sleeves pushed to her elbows, counting out coin with hands he would have recognized in any lifetime, in any disguise, in any name she'd apparently chosen to hide behind. He stopped walking so abruptly that his own escort nearly collided with him. Lily. The woman looked up at the sound of her name, and Marcus watched, with growing, devastating disorientation. Exactly nothing happened behind her eyes. No shock, no recognition, no flicker of the 3 years and the entire shattered marriage that name should have carried between them. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice carrying a calm, careful courtesy she would never once have offered him during their marriage. "You must have me confused with someone else." "My name is Wren." "Wren," Marcus repeated, the false name landing strange and wrong in his mouth. "I don't believe I'm confused." "I'm afraid you are," she said, already turning back to her market stall's ledger with a composure Marcus understood. Watching her was considerably more deliberate than genuine indifference could ever manage. "Was there something you needed to purchase?" Marcus stood there a long, disoriented moment. 3 years of carefully managed grief and guilt suddenly, catastrophically colliding with a woman standing 3 feet away, alive and apparently thriving in a village he'd stumbled into entirely by accident, calmly informing him, with a stranger's polite detachment, that she had never once known him. "No," he said finally, understanding, with growing certainty, that whatever this careful, practiced denial actually protected, pushing further in the middle of a crowded market square would accomplish nothing beyond confirming exactly the attention she clearly, desperately wanted to avoid. "Forgive the intrusion." He walked away, with his heart hammering considerably harder than any battlefield had ever managed to produce, understanding, with dawning, devastating clarity, that the woman he'd spent 3 years believing had betrayed his throne and vanished into disgraced obscurity had, in fact, simply erased herself entirely, and that whatever had actually happened 3 years earlier, inside his own palace, required an explanation his royal council had apparently, catastrophically failed to provide him with the truth about. Marcus Vane had married Lily Ashworth 6 years earlier, in a bonding that had struck with the moon's characteristic, undeniable certainty during a border inspection tour that had, entirely by chance, brought him through her modest home village. She had carried no noble standing, no political alliance value, nothing beyond genuine warmth, considerable intelligence, and a mate bond that had, for 3 years, made Marcus Vane a considerably gentler king than his own council had initially expected from a young alpha raised on his father's harder, more calculating philosophy of rule. The marriage had ended 3 years earlier, in circumstances Marcus had spent considerable, careful effort convincing himself represented straightforward, if devastating, betrayal, a formal council session, evidence presented with methodical, damning precision, confirming that Lily had been secretly corresponding with a rival territory's military attaché, sharing details of Ashgrove's own defensive positions in exchange for what the evidence suggested was a considerable secret payment, intended to fund her own eventual departure from a marriage she'd apparently grown tired of. Marcus had confronted her with the evidence in a private audience that had, in his own memory, unfolded with devastating clarity. Lily's shock, her desperate denials, her insistence that the correspondence was forged, that she'd never once met the attaché in question, that someone within the palace itself had deliberately fabricated everything to destroy their marriage. He had not believed her. The evidence had seemed, at the time, considerably too thorough, too methodically documented, to represent anything beyond genuine, devastating fact. He had formally dissolved their bond within the week, understanding, with the particular, cold certainty grief sometimes disguised as clarity, that a king who couldn't act decisively against his own mate's apparent treason would never command genuine respect from a council already skeptical of his youthful sentiment. Lily had disappeared within days of the formal dissolution, and Marcus had spent 3 years telling himself that her disappearance simply confirmed her genuine guilt, a woman fleeing consequences, rather than an innocent woman fleeing a kingdom that had just, devastatingly, condemned her on evidence she'd insisted, right up until the moment guards escorted her from the palace, was entirely fabricated. He had not known, could not have known, given how thoroughly the conspiracy against her had been constructed, that the evidence presented before his own council had been carefully manufactured by 3 of his most trusted advisers. Lord Cashenmarrow, whose own daughter had once been considered a considerably more politically advantageous match before Lily's unexpected mate bond disrupted those careful marriage plans entirely. General Aldrich Thorne, whose military ambitions had chafed for years against a queen whose commoner origins he'd never once respected, and a third, quieter conspirator whose own motives Marcus would not fully understand until considerably later, once the truth finally, catastrophically began surfacing. They had fabricated the correspondence with considerable, patient care, forged handwriting, a genuinely bribed attaché, willing to confirm a false account under careful questioning, a paper trail methodical enough that even Marcus's own considerable, initial doubt had eventually, devastatingly given way to certainty. Lily had fled not from guilt, but from genuine terror, understanding, in the desperate days following her formal exile, that whoever had constructed such an elaborate conspiracy against her possessed resources and reached considerably beyond what a simple, wrongly disgraced former queen could hope to survive challenging directly. She had chosen disappearance over continued danger, erasing every formal trace of her royal identity with the same careful, methodical precision the conspiracy against her had once employed, settling eventually in the remote mountain village of Hollow's Reach, 3 years' careful distance from the palace and the throne, and the husband whose belief in fabricated evidence had cost her everything she'd once genuinely loved. She had built, across those 3 years, a modest, genuinely peaceful life, considerably smaller than a queen's palace existence, but entirely, deliberately her own, free from any conspiracy she couldn't properly identify or defend herself against. She had not expected, walking to her market stall on an ordinary autumn morning, that the man responsible for her exile would ride into her village entirely by accident, chasing an unrelated grain theft investigation, and recognize her instantly, despite 3 years and a stranger's careful, practiced name. Lily's hands shook, once, brief and uncontrolled, before she managed to still them entirely, a betrayal her own careful, 3-year discipline hadn't fully accounted for, standing 3 feet from the man whose belief in fabricated evidence had once destroyed everything she genuinely loved. She watched him walk away through her market stall's careful, practiced composure, understanding, with mounting dread, that whatever brief encounter had just occurred represented considerably more danger than 3 years of careful, deliberate invisibility had prepared her to properly manage. "You all right, Ren?" Old Tomas, the neighboring stall's owner, glanced over with genuine, easy concern. "You've gone considerably pale." "I'm fine," Lily said, forcing her voice into something considerably steadier than she genuinely felt. "Simply tired. The morning's been busier than usual." She spent the remainder of that day in a state of careful, controlled vigilance, watching the village's main square with growing, considerable unease, understanding that Marcus Vane rarely traveled without a considerable royal escort, and that his continued presence in Hollow's Reach, for whatever original reason had actually brought him, represented exactly the kind of exposure she had spent 3 careful years working to avoid. She found him again that evening, entirely by accident, standing alone outside the village's single modest inn, apparently having dismissed his escort for whatever private business had brought him back to precisely the market street where their earlier encounter had occurred. "You're still here," she said, before she could properly stop herself, 3 years of careful discipline momentarily failing against genuine, unexpected surprise. Something flickered across Marcus's controlled expression, hope, and beneath it, careful, considerable restraint. I confess, considerable business detained me longer than originally planned." "That's a coincidence," Lily said, forcing her careful composure back into place, "given how thoroughly you claimed, this morning, not to know me at all." "I claimed nothing," Marcus said carefully. "You informed me I was mistaken. I chose not to argue in the middle of a crowded market square, though I confess I don't genuinely believe I was mistaken." Lily studied him for a long, careful moment, 3 years of accumulated fear warring against a genuine, complicated grief she'd never fully allowed herself to properly examine. "Whatever you believe," she said finally, "I need you to understand something, Your Majesty. Whoever you think I am, that person no longer exists. I've built a life here, entirely my own, and I have absolutely no intention of allowing anything from my supposed former existence to disrupt it." "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," Marcus said, something raw entering his careful, controlled voice. "I only need to understand what actually happened 3 years ago. I've spent considerable time believing a version of events that, standing here now, I understand I never properly, thoroughly examined." "There's nothing to understand," Lily said, though her voice carried considerably less conviction than the words alone suggested. "I don't know what version of events you're referring to. I've never met you before this morning." Lily, her true name, spoken quietly and directly, made her flinch despite her best, careful effort at composure. "Please. I understand 3 years of hard-won safety makes trust genuinely difficult. I only ask for the chance to properly explain myself before you decide entirely, permanently, that I'm not worth that particular risk." Lily stood in the cold evening air a long, considering moment, 3 years of careful, deliberate distance warring against a grief and genuine curiosity she hadn't expected to feel resurfacing this immediately. "You have exactly one conversation," she said finally, "to explain whatever you believe requires explaining. After that, Your Majesty, I need you to leave Hollow's reach and never return. Whatever peace I've built here, I won't risk it for a man who once believed considerably worse of me than I ever actually deserved." They met the following evening, in a quiet corner of the village's modest inn, Lily insisting on public, visible surroundings rather than any private meeting that might draw unwanted, considerable attention. "Tell me," she said, once they'd settled across from each other with careful, deliberate distance, "exactly what you believe you understand now, that you apparently didn't understand 3 years ago." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Understanding this particular conversation required considerably more honesty than any political negotiation his 16 years of rule had ever demanded of him. "I believe the evidence my counsel presented," he said finally. "Correspondence, apparently in your own hand, exchanged with a rival territory's military attaché, alongside financial records suggesting considerable payment received in exchange for defensive intelligence. I confronted you with it, and you denied everything, and he stopped, old grief and shame moving visibly across his careful composure. "I didn't believe you. I chose the evidence over my own wife's word, and I formally exiled you within a week, without ever once properly investigating whether the evidence itself might be false." "It was false," Lily said, old fury and devastating grief tangling together beneath her careful control. "Every single piece of it. I never once wrote that correspondence. I never met that attaché in my entire life. Someone constructed an elaborate, thorough lie, Marcus, and you believed it without asking a single genuine question. I know, Marcus said, the admission costing him considerable, visible weight. I've had 3 years to properly understand exactly how thoroughly I failed you, Lily. I don't have any excuse that genuinely explains it. I was frightened of political instability, of my counsel's growing skepticism, of everything my father's harder philosophy always insisted a proper king should never allow personal sentiment to compromise. I let that fear override every single thing I genuinely knew about your character. Lily absorbed this with a grief considerably more complicated than the simple fury she'd carried through 3 years of careful, isolated survival. Do you know who actually constructed the evidence? She asked finally. I don't yet, Marcus admitted. I've only just begun properly, thoroughly investigating, since discovering you here yesterday. I intend to understand exactly who did this, Lily, and to see them face genuine, appropriate consequences for what they've cost us both. Us both, Lily repeated, something sharp entering her voice. You lost a wife you believed had betrayed you, Marcus. I lost my entire life. My home, my title, every relationship I'd built within the palace, and 3 years spent in genuine, constant fear that whoever fabricated the evidence against me might eventually decide I remained too dangerous a loose thread to leave permanently hidden. Those losses are not remotely equivalent. You're right, Marcus said quietly.
I'm sorry, Lily.
That comparison was thoughtless. They sat together a long, difficult moment, 3 years of accumulated grief and betrayal settling heavily between them, and Lily understood, watching Marcus's genuine, considerable discomfort with his own past failure, that whatever remained of the man she'd once loved carried considerably more honest reckoning than the cold, decisive king who'd once so swiftly condemned her. I need time, she said finally, before I decide what any of this actually means going forward. I've spent 3 years building a life that doesn't require your presence, Marcus. I'm not prepared to simply abandon that because you've finally, belatedly, begun questioning what you should have questioned 3 years ago. I understand, Marcus said. I don't expect immediate forgiveness, Lily. I only ask for the chance to properly investigate what actually happened and to demonstrate, over whatever time you're willing to allow, that I genuinely intend to make this right, however long and difficult that process actually proves. Marcus returned to Ashgrove's capital within the week, understanding, with growing, controlled urgency, that whoever had constructed the elaborate conspiracy against Lily 3 years earlier remained, potentially, still active within his own court, a genuine, ongoing danger rather than simply historical injustice requiring careful, retrospective accounting. He summoned his chief investigator, a careful, methodical man named Bram Halloway, who had joined the Crown's service 2 years after Lily's exile and carried no personal history that might compromise his genuine, thorough investigation. I need a complete review, Marcus said, of every piece of evidence presented against Queen Lily 3 years ago. Every document, every witness statement, every signature. I want to understand exactly who constructed it and precisely how thoroughly it was fabricated. Halloway's careful investigation, conducted over the following 3 weeks with methodical, patient precision, gradually revealed a conspiracy considerably more organized and deliberate than Marcus had originally understood. The correspondence's handwriting, Halloway reported, laying out his findings with careful, thorough documentation, was analyzed by 3 separate expert scribes, none aware of the document's original context. All 3 identified subtle inconsistencies, suggesting deliberate forgery, considerably too consistent across the entire correspondence's supposed timeline to represent genuine handwriting variation. And the attaché's testimony? Marcus asked. I traced the man's current whereabouts, Halloway said. He's since retired from military service, residing in a considerably more prosperous estate than his former salary should have permitted. I arranged a private, informal conversation, Your Majesty, and he confirmed, once presented with the discrepancy, that his original testimony had been considerably incentivized. By whom? Holloway hesitated, understanding the weight of what he was about to confirm. Lord Cashin Marrow, Your Majesty, alongside General Aldrich Thorne. The financial records I've traced suggest their combined, coordinated involvement in the entire fabricated conspiracy. Marcus felt something cold and devastating settle into his chest, understanding, with growing fury, exactly whose careful, patient betrayal had cost him and Lily 3 entire years. Marrow and Thorne, he repeated slowly, both of whom remain seated on my own council to this day. Yes, Your Majesty, Holloway confirmed grimly. I'd recommend considerable caution moving forward. Both men command significant, ongoing influence within this court. A hasty, unprepared confrontation risks alerting them to abandon caution entirely, potentially destroying remaining evidence before formal charges can be thoroughly prepared. What was their motive? Marcus asked. Beyond simple, general skepticism toward my marriage to a commoner. Lord Marrow's own daughter, Lady Seraphine, was considered a genuine potential match for you, Your Majesty, before your bond with Lily disrupted those particular, careful political ambitions, Holloway said. General Thorne, meanwhile, has expressed, in private correspondence I've since uncovered, considerable frustration regarding what he perceived as your marriage's damage to this crown's proper, traditional authority and military discipline. Marcus absorbed this with growing, controlled fury, understanding exactly how thoroughly his own trusted advisors had manipulated an entire marriage's collapse to serve their own considerable, calculated ambitions. I want continued, careful investigation, he said finally. Gather every remaining piece of evidence, Holloway, thoroughly and methodically, before I move against either man. I don't intend to repeat the exact mistake that originally destroyed my marriage, acting on incomplete evidence, without thoroughly understanding the full truth first. Marcus returned to Hollow's Reach 3 weeks later, understanding, with growing urgency, that whatever conspiracy had originally destroyed his marriage remained active and considerably dangerous, and that Lily's continued safety, hidden though she believed herself to be, required considerably more protection than her own careful, 3-year isolation could genuinely guarantee. He found her at the same market stall, considerably more guarded than their previous careful conversation had suggested she might eventually become. You came back, she said, something wary entering her voice despite the genuine, growing warmth she'd been deliberately managing throughout his absence. I discovered who constructed the conspiracy against you, Marcus said, without preamble, understanding the situation's genuine urgency outweighed careful, gradual diplomatic approach. Lord Cashin Marrow and General Aldrich Thorne. Both remain seated on my council, Lily, and I have considerable, thorough evidence confirming their involvement. Lily's careful composure cracked, old grief and fresh, devastating vindication moving visibly across her features. You believe me now. I believed you 3 weeks ago, Marcus said quietly. I only needed proper evidence to formally act against the men responsible, rather than simply my own genuine understanding of your character. What happens now?
Lily asked.
I intend to move against them formally, Marcus said, before the full council, with complete, thorough documentation. But Lily, I need you to understand something important before I proceed. Once this becomes public, once Marrow and Thorne understand their conspiracy's exposure is imminent, they may consider you a genuine, considerable threat requiring immediate, permanent silencing. Lily felt old, familiar fear resurface with fresh, devastating urgency. You think they'll come here? I think it's possible, Marcus said grimly. I'd like to arrange proper protection, Lily. Discreet guards, positioned carefully throughout the village, without drawing obvious attention to exactly why. I don't want royal guards swarming my village, Lily said, old, considerable frustration entering her voice. I've spent 3 years building a genuinely quiet, peaceful life here. I won't have that disrupted. I understand, Marcus said. I'm not asking for anything obvious or disruptive. Simply careful, discreet protection, until this conspiracy is formally resolved. Lily studied him for a long, considering moment, 3 years of hard-won independence warring against the genuine, growing understanding that whatever danger now surrounded her required considerably more resources than her own careful, isolated life could currently provide. All right, she said finally. Discreet protection. But Marcus, I need you to understand, this doesn't mean I've decided anything about us going forward. Whatever happens with Marrow and Thorn, that's entirely separate from whatever remains unresolved between the two of us specifically. I understand that distinction clearly, Marcus said. I'm not asking for anything beyond your genuine safety right now. Everything else can wait until this particular danger is completely resolved. Neither of them yet understood exactly how quickly that particular danger would prove considerably more urgent than either had properly anticipated. Lord Cassian Marrow learned of Marcus's careful investigation within days, his own considerable network of court informants proving, even after 3 years of relative dormancy, entirely capable of detecting exactly the kind of methodical inquiry Holloway's team had been conducting. He's found her, Marrow said, meeting privately with General Thorn in a location carefully chosen to avoid any potential palace surveillance. The king has been asking questions, Aldrich. Careful, thorough questions about the evidence we constructed 3 years ago. How considerable is his suspicion? Thorn asked, genuine alarm evident beneath his own careful, military composure. Considerable enough, Marrow said grimly, that I believe formal exposure is imminent, unless we act decisively before he completes whatever thorough documentation his investigators apparently compiling. What do you propose? The former queen remains our genuine, considerable vulnerability, Marrow said. If she's genuinely alive, and the king has genuinely located her, she represents living testimony that could confirm every piece of our fabricated evidence's falsehood. I propose we address that vulnerability directly before formal exposure becomes entirely unavoidable. Thorn's expression hardened with cold, calculated resolve. You're suggesting we silence her permanently. I'm suggesting, Marrow said, that our own considerable survival requires it. 3 years of careful, patient political positioning, Aldrich, threatened entirely by a single woman's continued existence. I don't intend to allow that particular threat to remain unaddressed. They dispatched a small, carefully selected force within the day, professional, discreet operatives whose considerable experience with exactly this kind of delicate, dangerous work Marrow had cultivated across years of careful, patient political maneuvering. Marcus's own discreet protection, positioned throughout Hollow's reach exactly as promised, intercepted the first genuine sign of the approaching threat 3 days later, a village guard reporting unfamiliar, professionally armed men scouting the village's outer perimeter under cover of a routine winter hunting expedition's cover story. They're here, Marcus told Lily, urgent and grim, finding her in her modest cottage the moment the guard's warning reached him. Marrow and Thorn's men. I need you to gather whatever essentials you require, Lily. We need to secure your genuine safety immediately. This is exactly what I feared, Lily said, old terror resurfacing with devastating, immediate force. 3 years of careful hiding, and it only took a single, careless royal visit to bring this entire danger directly to my doorstep. I know, Marcus said, genuine guilt evident in his voice. I understand this is my fault, Lily. I promise you, whatever comes next, I intend to ensure you're genuinely, completely safe. The village's modest defenses proved considerably less prepared than the crisis genuinely required. Marcus's own discreet guard presence sufficient to detect the approaching threat but insufficient, in isolated numbers, to properly repel a professional, coordinated assault force without additional, urgent support. "I've sent for reinforcements from the nearest garrison," Marcus said, "but they won't arrive before nightfall. We need somewhere defensible, Lily. Somewhere we can hold until proper support genuinely arrives." "The old grain storehouse," Lily said, old fear giving way to careful, practical calculation. "Stone walls, a single defensible entrance. It's not ideal, but it's considerably better than my own cottage's thin wooden walls." They moved quickly through the village's gathering winter dusk, understanding, with growing dread, exactly how thin the margin between genuine safety and devastating repetition of Lily's original, catastrophic betrayal had suddenly, urgently become. The assault came just after full dark, Marrow and Thorne's professional operatives moving with the same careful, methodical precision that had once, 3 years earlier, constructed an elaborate conspiracy sufficiently convincing to deceive an entire royal council. Marcus's small guard contingent, positioned around the old grain storehouse's single defensible entrance, met the initial assault with disciplined, coordinated resistance, though the numerical disadvantage against professionally trained operatives quickly, dangerously became apparent. "There are considerably more of them than our initial estimate suggested," Marcus's guard captain reported, urgent and grim, retreating momentarily inside the storehouse's protective walls. "Your Majesty, I don't believe we can hold this position until reinforcements genuinely arrive." "Then we hold as long as genuinely possible," Marcus said, his own considerable alpha strength already engaged in the storehouse's defense, "and we make certain, whatever happens, that Lily survives this." Lily, positioned deeper within the storehouse's protected interior, watched the desperate defense unfold with growing, considerable dread, understanding, with devastating clarity, exactly how thoroughly Marrow and Thorne's conspiracy had followed her, even into the careful, isolated life she'd spent 3 years building specifically to escape it. "I won't simply hide while others fight to protect me," she said, finding a discarded length of iron among the storehouse's stored equipment, testing its weight with the same practical, determined resolve that had once, years earlier, made her considerably more capable than her gentle, commoner origins had initially suggested. "Lily, I've spent 3 years learning to protect myself, Marcus," she said, cutting off whatever protective objection he intended to raise. "I don't intend to simply wait passively while my own survival is decided entirely by others." The battle that followed unfolded through the storehouse's desperate, defensible walls, Marcus's disciplined guards gradually, methodically thinning the assault force's numbers despite the considerable, ongoing danger, Lily herself proving unexpectedly capable in the storehouse's confined, defensible space when two operatives finally, briefly breached the entrance's careful defense. It was General Thorne himself, arriving to personally oversee what he'd apparently understood required his own direct, considerable involvement, who finally forced the confrontation's devastating climax, appearing at the storehouse's breached entrance with cold, ruthless determination. "You should have remained hidden," Thorne said, addressing Lily directly, his careful military composure entirely abandoned in favor of considerable, desperate urgency. "Whatever peace you've built here, it ends tonight." "You've fabricated evidence to destroy my entire life," Lily said, her voice carrying fierce, unwavering resolve despite the considerable danger. "I don't intend to simply allow you to finish what you started 3 years ago." Marcus moved between them with controlled, absolute fury, understanding exactly what this particular confrontation genuinely required. "General Thorne, you will stand down immediately, or face this crown's full, decisive judgment." "Your crown," Thorne said, something desperate and considerable entering his voice, has already been thoroughly compromised by exactly the sentiment I once tried to warn you against. I don't intend to allow that particular weakness to cost this kingdom's genuine stability any further. The confrontation that followed proved brief and decisive. Marcus's considerable alpha strength and controlled, absolute fury more than sufficient against a general whose own careful, calculated conspiracy had never genuinely accounted for facing him directly. Thorn was subdued within minutes, the remaining assault forces' morale collapsing entirely once their own commander's defeat became genuinely, undeniably apparent. Royal reinforcements arrived shortly after, precisely as the storehouse's desperate defense finally, decisively concluded, and Marcus understood, watching guards secure Thorn and his remaining forces, exactly how narrowly this particular night's devastating repetition of Lily's original betrayal had genuinely been avoided. Marcus formally addressed the conspiracy before his own assembled warriors and council 3 days later, understanding, with hard-won clarity, that continued private handling of this particular crisis would only perpetuate exactly the kind of secretive court culture that had originally allowed Marrow and Thorn's conspiracy to succeed undetected for 3 entire years. 3 years ago, he addressed the assembled hall, Lily standing beside him rather than concealed behind careful, protective distance. This court condemned my former wife based on evidence I now understand was entirely fabricated. Lord Cashin Marrow and General Aldrich Thorn constructed that evidence deliberately, motivated by considerable, calculated ambition rather than any genuine loyalty to this crown. Murmurs swept through the assembled court, several nobles' gazes shifting immediately toward Marrow's own increasingly alarmed expression. General Thorn has already faced formal capture, Marcus continued, following his own attempted assault against Lily 3 nights past, an attack that would have resulted in her murder had my own protection not genuinely intervened. Lord Marrow, I want this entire court to understand, bears equal responsibility for this conspiracy's original construction. Marrow's composed expression finally, fully cracked, genuine desperation replacing his earlier careful control. Your Majesty, whatever accusations Thorn has made against me under duress. I have 3 weeks of thorough, methodical investigation, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying absolute, commanding authority, confirming your considerable financial involvement in fabricating the correspondence that destroyed my marriage. Forged handwriting samples, a bribed witness whose testimony has since been formally recanted, financial records connecting your own accounts directly to the entire elaborate conspiracy. Marrow's careful composure collapsed entirely, understanding, with growing horror, exactly how thoroughly his own conspiracy had finally, catastrophically unraveled. I want this court to understand something important, Marcus continued, turning to address the full assembled nobility directly. I believed fabricated evidence over my own wife's genuine word 3 years ago because I allowed fear and political pressure to override everything I genuinely knew about her character. That failure cost Lily 3 years of exile, genuine terror, and nearly 3 nights past her own life. I take full, personal accountability for that failure, regardless of how thoroughly Marrow and Thorn constructed the conspiracy that originally enabled it. He turned to Lily, understanding this particular moment required considerably more than simple formal judgment against the conspirators. I want this entire court to understand, he said, his voice carrying genuine, unguarded emotion he'd rarely permitted himself throughout 16 years of careful, controlled rule, that Lily Ashworth never once betrayed this crown, this marriage, or anything genuine trust ever required of her. Whatever formal title she chooses, going forward, I intend to spend whatever years remain of my reign properly, publicly correcting the devastating injustice this court allowed to unfold against her. The formal judgment against Marrow and Thorn, delivered following the council's brief but decisive deliberation, confirmed permanent exile alongside complete confiscation of their considerable accumulated estates. Marcus understanding, delivering the sentence personally, that whatever satisfaction execution might have offered paled considerably against the genuine, lasting justice of ensuring their calculated ambitions died permanently alongside their own political standing. Lily watched the formal proceedings conclude with a complicated mixture of hard-won vindication and old, permanent grief for 3 years that could never genuinely be reclaimed, her name formally, publicly restored, the truth finally, completely acknowledged before the entire court that had once condemned her. "It's over," Marcus said, finding her afterward in a quiet antechamber away from the court's continued, murmuring discussion of everything that had just unfolded. "Part of it," Lily said, echoing the particular, hard-won wisdom 3 years of survival had taught her. "My name is restored. Marrow and thorn are formally accounted for. But 3 years, Marcus, they don't simply disappear because justice has finally, belatedly arrived." "I know," Marcus said. "I don't expect them to. I only hope, genuinely, that we might still find our way toward building something worth having, going forward." Lily studied him for a long, considering moment, 3 years of careful, isolated survival warring against genuine, growing warmth. She hadn't expected to feel this thoroughly, watching him publicly, completely take accountability for a failure he could easily have distributed considerably more evenly across his own manipulated council. "I'm not returning to the palace," she said finally. "Not yet. Possibly not for considerable time, Marcus. I need to properly understand what I actually want, separate from whatever remains unresolved between us specifically." "I understand," Marcus said, and meant it with a patience 3 years of hard-won reflection had genuinely taught him. "I'm not asking you to become queen again, Lily. I'm not asking you to become anyone's wife at all, unless that's genuinely what you want. I'm simply asking for the chance to properly earn back whatever trust one destroyed 3 years ago through my own catastrophic failure of judgment." "What does that look like, practically?" Lily asked. "Visits," Marcus said. "Careful, patient ones, at whatever pace you determine genuinely comfortable. Letters, if you'll accept them. Whatever time it genuinely takes, Lily, for you to decide whether anything remains worth rebuilding between us." Lily returned to Hollow's Reach the following week, understanding, with growing, cautious hope, that whatever came next required considerably more patient, deliberate work than any single dramatic confrontation could ever properly resolve. Marcus visited monthly. At first, each visit governed by the same careful terms Lily had established from the very beginning. No premature promises, no assumption that consistency alone entitled him to anything beyond exactly what her own genuine readiness, at her own careful pace, chose to extend. He learned, gradually, the small, ordinary shape of the life she'd built entirely without him, her genuine skill at herbal medicine, developed through 3 years of necessary self-reliance, her careful, hard-won friendships with villagers who knew her only as Wren, considerably more genuine and uncomplicated than the careful political relationships her royal life had once required. The particular, quiet peace she'd found in ordinary, unglamorous work that demanded nothing beyond honest, skilled effort. "You've changed," she told him, nearly a year into his continued, patient visits, both of them sitting together in her modest cottage's small garden, watching an ordinary autumn evening settle gold and quiet around them. "I've had considerable time to understand exactly what my original failure actually cost," Marcus said. "I don't think I've fully changed, Lily. I think I've simply learned at considerable cost exactly what genuine trust actually requires: patience, considerable humility, and the willingness to properly, thoroughly question rather than simply accept convenient certainty." Lily reached for his hand, unhurried but genuine, the careful, guarded distance of nearly 4 combined years finally, gradually giving way to something considerably warmer. "I think," she said, "I'm finally ready to find out what that might actually mean going forward.
Slowly.
On my own genuine terms." Marcus felt something in his chest, carefully guarded through 4 years of grief and patient reconstruction, finally began to settle into genuine, hard-won peace. He had ridden into Hollow's Reach chasing an unrelated rumor about grain theft, and had found instead a woman he'd spent 3 years believing lost to genuine betrayal, and had discovered, across the following patient, difficult months, that winning her genuine forgiveness required considerably more honest, sustained effort than any single dramatic rescue or formal court reckoning could ever properly provide. He understood now, watching her genuine, cautious warmth grow gradually stronger with every patient, honest visit, that some battles were never meant to be won quickly. They were meant, instead, to be fought slowly, honestly, and without any guarantee of victory, for as long as it genuinely took, and for exactly as long as she remained willing to let him keep trying. The end.